we'll jump in to the NEDPOD, just like that. So why GRVS? Now, when we started this particular macroeconomic understanding, right, or macroeconomic unit, one of the things that we were concentrating on is the idea that the government has a role in our economy. And we had to then work out the tools and the policies and why they were doing what they were doing. Right? So we talked about how the government was both a producer and a consumer. We talked about how the government puts lots of rules and regulations into an economy in order to help with all sorts of issues that might arise. So employment laws, consumer protection laws, environmental protection laws, competition laws, and intellectual property rights. We talked about subsidies, taxes, both direct and indirect, and tariffs, all interventions within an economy. And then we talked about the roles of the government. So we talked about how they, and we're specifically focusing on full employment at the moment, but we're going to be looking at inflation and growth and income inequality and even balanced trade. Right? So that's where we are heading with all of this. But we do need to know the policies, right, and be quite clear about what advantages and disadvantages each of these policies have, so that when we are giving advice, you know, should the government do this or not, we then have that clear understanding of whether that is a good policy or not. Put it back.
Okay.
Put it back. Put it back.
Yeah.
Right, we also said that there were goals, macroeconomic goals, that conflict with each other. So economic growth conflicts with the idea about inflation, the price level. Unemployment conflicts with the idea of inflation. So whatever we're targeting, there's going to be a trade-off and impact on one of the other economic objectives of the government. Two main tools that we're going to be focusing on and using quite a lot is these ideas of the monetary policy and the fiscal policy. And we introduced these a little while back. So when we discussed monetary policy, we said that it's about the money in the economy. So the word money was in there. We said it was about how much money is actually in the economy, physically, the actual physical amount of money, with the idea being that if there is more money available in the economy, then what will happen is people will then be able to use that money to go out and buy goods and services, therefore increasing the demand for those goods and services, increasing the demand for the workers who produce those goods and services, all of that potentially creating economic growth. But that might lead to inflation. So therefore, decreasing the amount of money in the economy might do the reverse, potentially decreasing the demand and therefore decreasing the price level, so inflation. So depending on what we're targeting with regards to monetary policy, we're either going to use the money supply to expand, or we're going to use the money supply in a contractionary way in order to either expand or contract the economy, depending on what we're targeting. We've also got interest rates in there as well. We're going to have another look at interest rates in a minute. Fiscal policy, that was the one about the government's spending, and the revenue that they have. So the taxation and their spending. And that can be relatively complicated. And if you're keeping up with the news, there's lots of argument and discussion about government spending in America at the moment. The budget that Joe Biden is attempting to pass is about $6 trillion US, which is a lot of money, a huge amount of money. All right, now, so we've done that. Now we talked, giving you examples of where the government could spend its fiscal policy. It could spend it on social security, health, education, defence, housing, and debt repayments. Any and all of these potentially to help grow the economy. Now, we've also talked about the fact that the government can get revenue, and it can get revenue principally from taxation. A lot of government revenue will come from taxation, both direct and indirect. So the income tax, right, company taxes, the sales of goods taxes, and also the demerit goods taxes, tariffs, in any of those sorts of fees and fines that the government might levy, they actually can become part of the government's revenue. The government can also sell goods and services. I don't know that they sell many. Goods in particular, I mean, they might, but they could sell a whole range of goods and services dependent on what they produce as a producer. So, for example, if the Malaysian government owns all of the, if they were to own all of the palm oil in the country, then they could sell all of the palm oil, and that could then be a source of revenue. Right? The sale of government-owned assets. So if the government owns something, it might actually choose to sell that asset in order to earn some money. And governments do that. So, for example, the New Zealand government sold off the railways, right? And local governments have sold off buildings that they previously owned, and that has generated some income for them. All right, now, so this is the idea of a budget. Okay, so you can have a budget, a personal budget, your mum and dad can have a budget, and the government also has a budget. The fancy word here is about a plan. So it's a plan for whatever income you earn and the expenditure, right, or what you spend of that income. So you can have three different states, if you will, of a budget. You can have a budget that's in deficit, which is a fancy way of saying that your income is less than your spending. You are in deficit. You can have a budget that is called balanced. That's where your income exactly equals your expenditure, your spending. Now that's quite hard to achieve, you would imagine. You can also have a budget that's in surplus. That's where your income is greater than your spending. So either of these two options here, the deficits or the surpluses, are going to be more likely, right, with regards to whichever country in the world you look at. But some countries might aim for a balanced budget, but you know, the chances of actually hitting a balanced budget are actually going to be quite slim, particularly at the moment. All right, now, I am going quickly through this because we've actually done aspects of this already, okay? And then I'm going to get to the material that is the in-depth section that we didn't get to last time because we went into unemployment, which was the important part at that point. But now we're trying to discuss with unemployment how to fix unemployment. So we now need to come back to this and discuss some of these policies, all right? So taxation was the compulsory payment to the government, right? That's their source of revenue. And the burden, right, is the amount of tax that households and firms have to pay. So burden, you think like a weight, something pushing down on you. Oh, I don't like this tax sort of idea. Now, when we analyze taxes, we can talk, as we saw before, about the idea of direct taxes and indirect taxes. So a direct tax was one that went directly to the government, hence the name. So ones that are typical with regards to being direct are income taxes. So whether that's a personal income tax or whether that's the income that a company earns, they tend to go directly to the government. Now, these days, governments can have a number of other direct taxes as well, but these are the two principal ones that you are likely to see in your exam. Indirect taxes, those are the taxes that do get paid to the government, but they go there indirectly, again, hence the name. So classic examples are GST, or Goods and Services Tax. In Malaysia, SST, or Sales and Services Tax. In the UK, VAT, or Value Added Tax. These are taxes that get added onto the price of a good or service. So it is the consumer who pays it first. That payment, that extra tax, then goes to, not to the government straight away, goes to the producer. The producer then has to collect all of that tax up and pay it to the government. That's why it's indirectly going to the government. Now, when we talk about taxes that are perhaps more income related, okay, whether that's personal income or company income, we can describe them in three different ways. So we can describe taxation as being progressive. If something is progressing, it's moving forwards, right? So it's progressing. A progressive tax is one where the proportion of tax that you pay increases as your income increases. Now that sounds quite nasty, but when you think about it, that's possibly fairer, all right? That if you're earning more income, you should, in theory, be paying more tax. That sounds a bit fair, okay? And also, we're not spelling out here how big an increase that is. It might be a small increase, as your income increases. I used to use the metaphor of steps, okay? So if you imagine climbing up steps, there's two different directions with a step. There's the depth of the step, and then there's the height of the step. So you can change the depth of the step and you can change the height of the step. And depending on how you change those makes it easier or less easy to go up and down the stairs. So for those of you who've ever gone to the UK, you will have noticed that in some of the houses, which might be up to 100 years old, some of their staircases are very narrow, and the stairs are quite narrow, and they're quite high. So it's like you're climbing a ladder instead of climbing a set of stairs. You kind of have to hold on to the sides to go up the stairs. It's quite an unusual situation. I didn't like it when I was there. We were staying at a house, and I was worried I was going to fall down the stairs, to be perfectly honest, because it was like climbing up a ladder and you had to climb down it kind of the same way. It was still classified as stairs. It's just that the depth of them and the height of them varied because of the age of the house and because of the way the house was built. Right? And back then, that's what they used to do. So you can imagine taxation being like that. So if it's a progressive tax, you move up a step, right, as your income rises. But the government decides how big that step is. So when does the next level kick in? When do you hit that next tax bracket? But they also decide the depth of that step. So they decide how long it will take, right, before you then hit the next step. Okay, so there's quite a bit of work that goes around that. We do delve into that a little bit at IB, okay, but governments need to consider that quite heavily because it's the fairness issue. It's the what proportion of tax paid issue. Is it fair? Do they pay enough? And obviously in America and around the world, this is a big debate at the moment. We can also have taxes that are regressive. Now, those taxes, the proportion paid of those taxes actually decreases as your income increases. So you're probably likely to argue that they are unfair, right? But here's the secret. Taxes that are on goods and services, like these ones, actually behave like a regressive tax. And the reasoning being is because if you're on a lower income, you're going to pay a greater proportion of your income on goods and services. So therefore, you're paying a greater proportion of these taxes, of your income in tax because of that. So yeah, you can make an argument that regressive taxes aren't fair. And in fact, you can make an argument that regressive taxes are pretty diabolical, right? For people who are on lower incomes. People who are on higher incomes are actually going to pay less proportion, okay? Then you've got this idea of a proportional tax. Some countries call it a flat tax. And the idea here is that you pay exactly the same proportion regardless of your income level. So if you were to set it at, say, 10, 15%, then it wouldn't matter how much your income was, you just pay that amount. Right? And some argue that's a bit fairer. Some might argue that's a bit more efficient in a sense because it will, this one here, you'd make an argument that people would try and avoid paying that tax. Whereas this one, they possibly wouldn't because it's too low for them to really worry about. So you might actually argue that you get more taxation revenue from this tax.
Mr. David?
Yeah.
If you say like the most used kind of taxation is what in this case, like for first world countries like Europe?
Yeah. Well, that's a tough one, Abu. Good to see you, by the way. Most governments will want an efficient form of income tax, okay? However, as you're going to discover when you grow up, when you start earning an income for yourself, you might be already, people don't like paying income tax. But there's ways that you can limit the amount of income tax you can pay, right? And certainly people who are on the much bigger incomes find ways to limit the amount of income tax that they pay. A classic example, in the UK, if you are contributing to your superannuation, right, your retirement income, you actually get that taken off of your tax. Right? So the more you put into your retirement savings, the less tax you end up having to pay, income tax-wise, with regards to that. It's complicated, but essentially that's what some people will do. In New Zealand, income tax-wise, if you declare yourself as earning no income at all, then you don't pay any income tax. So a lot of people in New Zealand can put all of their income into the assets that they own. So houses, cars, land, whatever it is that they have, their business. So if they own a small business, they might put all of their income into their small business and then just say, I'm not earning any income. The business is earning the income. Then they are paying business tax, but not personal income tax. So people can avoid paying income tax. There are also illegal ways to do it as well, and that's called tax evasion, and that is definitely illegal, and people can get into serious trouble with regards to that. But yeah, there are all sorts of, people will move money overseas to avoid paying taxes. People will do all sorts of things, It is something people don't like to do. So therefore, governments try and find more effective ways to tax people. So classic example is GST, right? Because everybody buys goods and services, then you're going to collect, in theory, more tax from that, more tax revenue. So GST is a more effective tax because people can't avoid it. You just can't. You're buying the good, you're paying the amount. It is, however, unfair on the people who have a lower income. Absolutely it is, and we know it is, but it is a more effective tax. And again, if you've gone to the UK and have a look at the houses, and I might have mentioned this to you before, I apologise if I have, but if you look at the houses in the UK, one of the things that you might find, particularly those old houses, like the ones that are 100 plus years old, you might find that they don't have a lot of windows. Right? And you might think to yourself, why would they build a house with very few windows in them? And what ended up happening was the government at the time was trying to increase its tax take. It was trying to increase the amount of revenue it was getting from taxes. So it worked out that people with higher incomes had bigger houses. And if they had bigger houses, they had more windows. So what they ended up doing, and I know this sounds absolutely crazy, but without a word of a lie, this is exactly what they did. They started charging people for the number of windows they had in their house. So they did exactly what you thought people would do. They took the windows out of their house. They boarded up the windows. So when you go to the UK and you have a look at those really old houses, in order to avoid paying tax, people boarded up their windows. It's crazy, but that's what they did. Yeah. In Greece, if you're familiar with Greece, obviously not the stuff you slip on when you put it on the ground, right? But if you're familiar with the country of Greece, they've had a lot of economic problems, particularly of late. Right? And some of their economic problems had to do with the amount of tax revenue they were trying to collect, and they just weren't getting enough of it. So what they ended up doing is they ended up saying, well, you must have a lot of money. You aren't declaring that you've got a lot of money, but you've got a very big house. So they didn't tax the windows this time. They actually taxed the swimming pools. So they put a swimming pool tax on. Of course, then people said, this isn't a swimming pool. It's a bird bath. Yeah, it's to clean the dog. They all sorts of ways to try and avoid paying this tax. So the Greek government ended up flying helicopters over the Greek islands with cameras, taking photos of people's houses to try and prove in court that they had a swimming pool. Because if they could prove they had a swimming pool, then they could prove that they weren't paying the taxes that they were supposed to be paying. So this is the extent that governments in some parts of the world have gone to try and encourage people to pay taxes. And it's crazy, potentially, like boarding up the windows, but that's what happens. Yeah, governments, people will avoid paying taxes. So the design of a tax model, a tax system, has to be really carefully thought about, because you end up potentially with less revenue than you were kind of hoping for. Okay, let's jump back into, very good question, Abu, and good to see you. Let's jump back in there, check that everybody's here, good. All right, so we had progressive taxation, regressive taxation, proportional taxation. All right, and what we now need to do is for you to mix find the pairs and match the pairs to the definition. All right, so which one's progressive, which one's proportional, which one's regressive. Away you go. Well done, look at those scores. Good, keep going, got a couple more to go.
Mr. David, which method is used more, like the most? Progressive, proportional, or regressive?
You'd have to make an argument for progressive tax being used the most. It tends to be viewed as the fairest, and yeah, there are arguments about whether it's fair or not. Okay, particularly those who are earning a lot of money, they are going to be the ones who particularly argue that it's not fair because they end up paying a large amount of their income in tax, potentially. But that's what it is. You can also argue from an economics point of view about incentives, right? So if the, hold on, I'll stop sharing for a minute. I'll jump back to here. So if you, say you're going for a promotion in whatever job it is that you have, and the promotion comes with a pay rise, okay? And then you look at the pay rise and you work out how big a jump that pay rise is from your existing pay. Then you work out how much extra tax you'll then need to pay, right, on that extra income. Some economists might argue, and some people might argue, that it's actually not worth the promotion to do that extra job because it's an extra job. It's more work, it's more difficult work potentially. So you want the reward from doing that extra work, that more difficult job. But if you get taxed more, maybe that extra reward for that job is a lot less than what you think. So yes, I'm getting a pay rise, woohoo, yay! But then you're getting taxed more. So is it actually worth it? So some economists might argue that, but generally speaking, economists will say, doesn't matter who they are, they will say a progressive tax is best. There are some who argue that a proportional tax is a better way to do it, because people won't avoid a proportional tax because it's not worth their time, because it's lower, right? It doesn't increase. So therefore, in theory, and it's not necessarily proved around the world, but in theory, you'd collect more revenue because people wouldn't be avoiding paying the tax. It also would potentially be fairer on lower and middle income earners because they would have less tax to pay. And they might then therefore be encouraged to spend more. And if that's the case, then, you know, you've got economic growth occurring. So there was one political party in New Zealand that advocated for a proportional or flat income tax. They didn't get it. But that was their major platform, their major political platform. That's what they were wanting. On a side note, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the government in New Zealand taxing you on TVs. And this is similar to the idea of window taxes. Because TVs back then, right, there weren't many people with TVs, and definitely if you had more than one TV, then your income level was considerably higher, right? So the government back then, in order to increase the tax revenue they were earning, would actually tax you on the number of TVs that you had, right? And you had more than one TV, obviously you get taxed more. Now, we had one TV, so, you know, it was a pain to pay this particular tax as a family, but it was something that, you know, we kind of thought, well, why is this happening? And then you had to ask yourself, how does the government know you have a TV? Right? And it became quite surreal, because what the government ended up doing was the government ended up asking the businesses that sold TVs to pass on the details of who they sold the TV to the government, so that the government could collect tax. Right? The government, so, you know, invasion of privacy a little bit there. But then it was worse, because then the government ended up sending Again, I'm not kidding you. This is New Zealand, right? The government ended up sending trucks down the road with like, I don't know, you've seen them in the spy films, the parabolic noise amplifiers. So they'd travel past people's houses and they'd listen to see if they could hear a TV. And then if they heard a TV, they'd go into their database and try and work out whether the person had paid tax or not. So crazy stuff. But that's the level governments around the world have gone to try and encourage people to pay taxes, because people do not like it. And you will find that when you start paying tax. In fact, you already are. Anytime you buy a good or service, you're paying a tax. Right? And you would be quite surprised because, again, I know I'm old, right? But when I was younger, there wasn't such a thing in New Zealand as GST. It hadn't come about at that point. So there was a point in time without GST. And it would be the same here in Malaysia. There would be a point in time, some of you will remember, when there wasn't a GST. Your parents definitely will. And things would have been cheaper. And then all of a sudden, GST gets added. In New Zealand, it was 10% when it first got added. Then the government increased it a few years later to 12.5% in order to increase the amount of tax revenue they were earning. Right, so you can imagine the price of goods and services in New Zealand, remembering that people have to ship it all the way from the other end of the world to New Zealand, then add another 10% or 12.5% on it. There was a government that came in, I think it was a Labour government, and their plan was to increase it further. And the next step wasn't 12.5%. The next step was to push it up to 20%. Again, it's a way to generate revenue. No real other reason than just to generate revenue. So taxes are hugely political, and they can cause enormous problems with people trying to get elected. So governments have to be incredibly careful with what they do with that. Okay, well done, team. All right, so progressive taxes, the ones that individuals pay a higher percentage of their income in tax. Regressive taxes, those are the ones where individuals pay less proportionally of their income in tax. And proportional taxes, those are the ones where individuals pay a fixed proportion in their tax of their income as tax. Well done, team. Now, we know this, okay, a lot of this has to do with human behavior, right? A lot of this has to do with some relatively straightforward models that we've dealt with, so the application of them. So we know that if there are taxes put on goods and services, taxes, that it's going to increase the price. Therefore, it will decrease the quantity demanded for those goods and services. Right? If it's a tax on income, it's going to decrease the demand for the goods and services. Right? And therefore decrease the price, but also decrease the quantity. So we do need to be a little bit careful about which tax we consider with that. It has an impact on economic growth. Right? If there is less goods and services being produced, if there is less income available, right, for people because of tax, then there's going to be less economic growth. However, there will be more revenue for the government, so the government potentially could use that revenue to help generate economic growth. So, swings and roundabouts in a lot of regards. And that is the very thing that has been argued about in America at the moment, about their $6 trillion budget that they are planning, and the idea that they can potentially raise more taxes, right, in order to help pay for their infrastructure spending that they're hoping to do. Impacting on inflation. And again, it's that same idea that it's increasing prices here, if it's a GST, for example, and that will then potentially cause inflation. However, if it's an impact on demand, it might actually decrease inflation. Impact on business location. Businesses are going to move, right? If they know that if they move their business to a different location, might even be a different country, right, then they may get taxed less, then they will do that, okay? It's one of the reasons why companies like Amazon and Google and Apple and these other businesses pay so little company tax, is because they actually offshore or put their core business actually in a different country, to America. So therefore they don't pay a whole lot of tax. There's an impact on social behavior, us, how we behave, right? we get a bit upset with people because we get taxed more and therefore we've got less income, but they've got more income, they're not paying their fair share of tax, you know, all of that sort of idea. So it impacts on our social behaviour. Impacts on the incentives to work. I've already mentioned how you can get a promotion, you can get a pay rise, but you also might need to pay more in tax. So it might lead to you deciding, yeah, I don't want that promotion. I don't want to work more and get paid relatively little for the extra work I do. Then we can talk about an impact on tax avoidance and evasion. And that's what we mentioned before, that because if we start increasing taxes, people might try and avoid paying it. People might evade paying it. Remember, that's the illegal one. And you know this one's illegal because it's got the letter E in front, which kind of sounds a bit like the letter I. So it's illegal, this one, yeah. Whereas tax avoidance isn't. An impact on the distribution of wealth. When we talked about regressive taxes, how they had a bigger impact on lower income earners. But we've also suggested that higher income earners are going to avoid paying taxes. And one of the ways that they avoid paying taxes is to put their income into assets. And the more assets they have, in theory, the wealthier they are. Right? So if I just stop the sharing just for a second, right? Now, the country in the world that has the highest level of income inequality, does anybody know what country it is?
Is that Sweden?
Nope. Highest level of income inequality. So the greatest gap, no problem, right? The greatest gap between high income earners and low income earners. Which country do we think we're talking about? It's one you all know. I can read that two ways. I do want to be a bit clearer. Which country is it? There's another way to say the country. Yes, the United States, thank you, as opposed to us. Right? Yes. The US, arguably the most developed country in the world, also has the greatest level of income inequality. Right? The USA has got more billionaires than any other country in the world. Right? It's also got more people at the other end of the spectrum. So that gap is enormous. There's a relatively few people earning all of that, and then there's everybody else. And the numbers are really scary. Right? It's like the top 1% of income earners in the States are earning more than half of all of the income in the entire US. That's the difference. Yeah, a lot of it has to do with the stock market and assets, right, that are tied to the stock market. In which case their value goes up and down. So for example, Jeff Bezos, right, Bezos, he owns Amazon. Right, he's the CEO of Amazon at the moment, and the share price is like $1 trillion basically worth of company. So the share value is huge, and because he owns a whole lot of shares, he's incredibly wealthy. He is the wealthiest man in the history of the world. All right? And then you've got everybody else. So it's not a big surprise that that group of people don't want to pay taxes, right? Because they will lose some of their money. Okay, right. Let's jump back in. Now, things that you could be asked. Now, again, there can be some quite tricky wording sometimes in some of these questions. So let's have a look. So examine how an increase in taxation could conflict with any two macroeconomic objectives of the government. Now, all of those economic objectives, so economic growth, price stability, income inequality, all of those can have significant effects or can be significantly affected by taxation. So it could be employment, right? And then you could say you're increasing taxes. So therefore, what happens? How will people who are working be affected? How will the businesses be affected? Does that mean that because the costs of their goods are higher, they're then going to not be able to afford to employ people? You know, all of those sorts of arguments can come into play. Economic growth. More taxes, as we said, higher prices. Prices conflicting with the inflation conflicting then with economic growth, or inflation conflicting with employment. So depending on the argument that you're making, right, you can quite straightforwardly come up with two macroeconomic objectives and then explain how it conflicts with those. Now there's two, so it's roughly 3 marks per macroeconomic objective. Now there are videos in there that can go in a bit more detail again. All right. Now, the next skill that you need is to be able to evaluate. And this is where we go deeper in to the conversation. So now we start asking, okay, the government has this tool, but, all right, does the government recognize, so here's the first problem with fiscal policy, right? Taxation, spending. So when we're thinking particularly about spending, but also about taxation, does the government actually recognize that there's a problem? Right? If you saw the previous United States government, right, not the one that's currently in, okay, the one run by some muppet somewhere, right? That particular government seemed not to see a whole lot of problems that there really were that desperately needed the government to intervene with. So the longer it took for the government to say, hey, look, there's a problem, okay, becomes then a limitation to how successful their fiscal policy can be at solving some of these problems. And also the idea that there's administration. Even now that the US has got a government that's actually noticing these problems, it still takes them an awful long time to get through all of the varying layers of administration that there are. They have to get it past this group of people, and then these people have to agree, and then those people, and it takes a while. And it's possibly the same here in Malaysia, right? It might be the same in other countries around the world. It's definitely that way in New Zealand. You've got to get a certain number of politicians to agree on any particular policy in order for it to take place. And if they don't, then you've got to go back and discuss more and change things, right? And by the time all of that's happened, the problem may have gotten worse, right? Now, if you're thinking Joe Biden doing his infrastructure spending that he's wanting to do in the States, well, why would he be wanting to do that? And the reason being is that they didn't recognize it as a problem for about 20 years. They didn't do anything about it, right, for about 20 years. And now it is at a point where the US has got some serious infrastructure problems that it has to address. But even now that they recognize the problem and they're working towards it, they're still having this particular administrative problem, trying to get politicians to agree. And the next one here is an impact lag. Even when you have put the policy in place, it's not going to happen immediately, right? There will be a flow out of the effects, and it will take time for those effects to actually occur. So by the time the effects have actually hit the economy, eventually, right, they hit the economy, it may be that the problem is worse and you need to do some even more, bigger policy. Let's cut taxes. Okay, we've cut taxes. We recognize that we need to cut taxes. Oh, it takes us 2 years to actually achieve the cutting of the tax. Right? And by the time we've done that, we actually need more tax cuts, but we can't because then we have to go back and sort that out, and we don't recognize that. Oh, and then it's going to take time for the tax cuts to affect in the economy, and by the time it takes effect in the economy, we then need to start all over again and figure out what the new problems are. So a lot of limitations to fiscal policy. So when the exam question says, is cutting taxes the best policy to achieve economic growth, these are some points that you can raise and say, well, however, maybe not. Explain why expansionary fiscal policies may cause a budget deficit for the government. Only 4 marks, so you're going to be spending about 6 minutes potentially on that question. Right? And you're going to be thinking about those fiscal policies. So what are they about? They're about expansionary policies. So they're about increasing government spending. Well, that's going to have an effect on the budget. They're about decreasing taxation. So that, again, is going to have an effect on the budget and potentially cause a deficit. All right. Now, we looked at what money was quite some time ago. We talked about what it was. We talked about the reasons for having money, in particular, this idea of mediums of exchange, so money in the middle of the exchange. But now we need to go in a little bit more depth because money is more complicated than what we even discussed back then. Okay, and you'll be familiar with this because it turns up in the news quite a bit. Right? When we think about money these days, a lot of people get confused. Okay, the general understanding people have of money is this one. If you think this circle here, M1, right? The idea that that is notes and coins. That's what we understand money is in there. But money, people use other things for money. So it might be that you've got security deposits somewhere, term deposits. Okay. And those can be used as money, right? You've got money in a different account, but you can't access it for 6 months. So technically it's not as easy to use as a note and coin in your wallet, but potentially it could still be used. Then if you go even further out into the universe of money, this M3 idea, kind of like BMWs, this is the M3 version, then you've got things that aren't technically money, but people can still use them as money. So assets are a classic example. So Bitcoin is not money. Bitcoin is an asset. However, people seem to use Bitcoin as a form of money. So it kind of fits in here. It's definitely not easy to use, right? But it kind of fits into these realms. And the Dogecoin or whatever it's called, all of that sort of asset class of money, right, doesn't fit within M1, but could potentially fit into M2 or maybe even M3. Then you've got things that you might have. You might have your own personal aeroplane. You might have a famous painting on your wall that you could sell and get some money. So theoretically, you could use that as a form of currency, as a form of money, but it's nowhere near as easy as if you've just got the money in your bank account. All right? So money is 3 different levels, depending on what's called liquidity, depending on how liquid the money is. So the more liquid it is, the more easy it is to use. So when we talk about liquidity, we are describing an act of being able to use money. And the less liquid the asset is, the less easy it is to use. So M1 is the most liquid.
Mr. David, where would gold be?
Well, gold is an asset. So it would fall under potentially M3. Okay. Similar silver and the other things as well. And at the moment, you'll have seen the price of gold going through the roof, and it's going to keep going for a little bit at any rate, I would imagine, because people view gold as being a kind of like an emergency currency. They worry that if the economy doesn't improve, then at least they'll have gold and they'll be able to use gold to buy things. Right? So because they believe gold will hold its value, gold will always be valuable. There'll always be a demand for it. And at the moment, it is tracking up. Silver as well, hugely tracking up. And people buy it because there's uncertainty in the economy. Right? There are, obviously the situation we've got, people are really worried. And as soon as the news came out about India, price of gold went through the roof. Price of silver started going up, right? Because people were really worried, right, about the economy around the world. So yeah, you could use it as a form of money, but just not as easily as money. Good questions. Okay, now we also discussed the idea of a central bank or a reserve bank, and part of what we did back then was to say that that central bank was the bank for the banks, the commercial banks. It was also the bank for the government. So therefore the central bank or the reserve bank held on to a huge amount of money. And because they have that amount of money sitting in their vaults, basically, or in their computers more likely these days, they're actually able to manipulate monetary policy because they've got the actual money. So if the government says we want there to be less money in the economy, they can go and tap the central bank and go, hey, less money, please. And they will do it, all right? If they want interest rates to rise, because that's part of monetary policy, the central bank can achieve that. Remembering that there is expansionary and contractionary, those are the terminologies that we need to use. Right, so if we're thinking expansionary, then it's about interest rates, okay, and the money supply. It's about decreasing interest rates, making loans more affordable for people, therefore by expanding the amount of money in the economy. If it's about the money supply, it's about just allowing there to be more money available, excuse me, and therefore people spend more and the economy grows more. If it is contractionary, the monetary policy, then it's about interest rates increasing, again, making it more expensive to borrow money. So therefore, people will be less likely to borrow money. And because interest rates are higher, more likely to save money, so they put off their spending and thereby decreasing the demand for goods and services in the economy, thereby potentially decreasing inflation, which we're going to look at. And also the money supply. If you decrease the amount of money supply in the economy, then that would be classified as contractionary. Now, you can find lots of examples of monetary policy around the world, all right? Lots and lots and lots of them, because all countries around the world, particularly at the moment, are very heavily using monetary policy, desperately trying to get their economies to grow, right? As well as fiscal, particularly monetary policy. Now, some of the terminology that gets used in the news is a bit different and might need a little bit of an explain, okay? Now, I'm not saying any of this will turn up in your exam, but it does turn up in the news. And the problem with it turning up in the news is that it might then get chosen as a case study that you then need to explain in your exam. So kind of a roundabout way. Also, if you are reading the news, and you might see these and wonder what they all mean. So the discount rate, right, particularly America, right, there's a discount rate in America. That's what the US Fed tends to discuss. Right, so the discount rate there is essentially it's the interest rate. It's the interest rate that the central bank charges the commercial banks. And it's called the discount rate. So that's just a fancy way of saying interest rate, but it's a special interest rate. It's the interest rate that the central bank charges registered banks. Okay. Sorry, I'm just hearing my son in the background, and I'm wondering if I need to go down and intervene. Right, in New Zealand, it's not called a discount rate. The Reserve Bank in New Zealand call it an OCR, or official cash rate, but it means the same thing, okay? In America, this gets used quite a lot, all right? This is called the bond market. We will deal a little bit more with this when you hit IB Economics, but the bond market, my favorite, of course, is James. The bond market it's kind of the reverse of the money market, in a way. And what it is it's like if you ever borrowed money from anybody and promised to pay it back, that's kind of what the bond market is, right? But it's the government doing it. So the bond market is when the government goes to Abu and says, Abu, we'd like to borrow $50 million from you. And Abu says, yeah, right. And so the government then gives Abu a piece of paper that says, we owe you $50 million and we will pay it back. And this is the important part, on this date at this interest rate. So you actually get a rate of return, right, for the bonds, okay? And you know you're going to be paid at that time. So the US government, particularly of late, issues an awful lot of bonds because it uses that to get revenue for its expenditure, all right? That's what it uses that for. Now, part of that is a little bit concerning maybe as well because, how much money can they borrow? But it also enables them to decrease the amount of money in the actual economy because if we take the $50 million, if the government takes the $50 million from Abu, he doesn't then have the $50 million himself. He just has a little piece of paper which says we owe you $50 million. So therefore we can decrease the amount of money in the economy quite quickly. Now in America, you'll see there are like 5-year bonds, there are 10-year bonds, 15-year bonds, 20-year bonds, 30-year bonds. So you have to wait a wee while to get your money back in some cases. And the previous US government, right, the one that shall not be named, they were talking about 50-year bonds. Now, a 50-year bond is essentially what they call intergenerational. So it means that if Abu was to lend the US government $50 million at a 50-year bond, he wouldn't get the money back from it, right? It would be his grandchildren, potentially, who would get that money back. So, it gives them more time in order to repay it. The reserve requirement's a little bit more complicated, and it's basically only America. There aren't many other countries that do this now. And it's pretty much exactly as it sounds, right? It's a requirement. It's a legal requirement that the government, the US government, puts on the reserve banks, the central banks, not the central banks, the legal requirement that the US government puts on commercial banks with regards to how much reserves they must, by law, have. So if the central bank, if the commercial bank gets a deposit from Emma of $100, and they say, well, we want to make money off of this $100, so they might choose to lend out $80 of that. They have kept $20 in reserve. Now, it might be that the US government has said you must keep 20%, because that's the 20 out of 100. You must keep 20% as a reserve. Therefore, that is your reserve requirement. Right? Or it might be that they say you have to keep 10% or 5% or 2.5%, right? And it depends very much on how confident they feel in the bank, but how confident they feel in the economy as well, or how much they're wanting to expand the amount of money that's in the economy. So that's the reserve requirement. So in case that turns up in an exam, or if it turns up in any of the articles or the news that you watch or read, that's what that all means. Now, there is Mr. Clifford, his video in there, and very, very good explanation again about monetary policy that you can review. Now, let's evaluate monetary policy. And one of the key aspects of this evaluation is to, all right, there was a lot of noise downstairs. You okay?
Yeah.
Right. This is, again, it's that, okay, we've got this tool, but however, is it effective? So one of the key things that we need to consider, and it's with fiscal policy as well, but also with monetary policy, is that there are time lags. How long will the effects take? Right? So we put the policy in place. We want it to achieve a certain result, a certain effect, but how long will that actually take? All right? If it takes too long, then by the time the actual effect happens, we may need to do something more in order to help that situation. Consumer and business behavior. We might be decreasing interest rates, hoping desperately that people will spend money, but maybe they don't. Yeah. It's one of the situations that we're currently in, is that central banks all around the world, governments all around the world, decreased interest rates tremendously so. There were some countries that actually decreased their interest rates to below zero. They had actually negative interest rates. All right? They were that desperate for people to go out and spend money. But of course, it was the pandemic. People were worried that they were going to lose their job. People were worried that they needed money. So they held on to their money. They didn't go out and spend it, particularly in the UK, right? Which meant that the actual policy had very little effect at that time, right? Maybe later it will have an effect, so that time lag occurring, right? But also, how big a change does it need to be in order for consumers to actually, and businesses to actually, behave in the way you want them to? Let's decrease interest rates by 0.25%. Is that a big enough change? Does it need to be 0.5%? Does it need to be a whole percent? So there's a lot of discussion that needs to go into that. We're also not taking into account anything else that's going on, like, as mentioned, the pandemic, right? We can do these policies, but there's a whole lot of other stuff going on, and none of that is actually taken into account. It's just monetary policy, and is it effective? We also need to think about fiscal policy as well, because we could, and this is kind of one of those weird situations where the government might want to combat inflation, but it might also be politically worried about contractionary fiscal policy, so they might do expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary monetary policy. So depending on the sort of the combination of those two policies, the effects, which may take time, could be quite varied from what you might expect. Next one is about the objectives. Governments change, objectives change, right? So the previous US government administration had particular objectives, maybe making themselves more wealthy, and this current US government has different objectives, and therefore new policies, etc., need to be put in place. So a lot of discussion about the effectiveness of monetary policy, all right? And we do need to understand that there are always going to be trade-offs. Anytime we put policies in place, it's going to conflict with other policies. So if we're trying to combat inflation, we're going to have an impact on employment. If we're trying to affect employment, we're going to have an effect with inflation. So whichever way we do it, we're going to have a trade-off, and that's something we need to make sure we understand so that we can include that in our answers. Now, those of you who remember the 1980s, which possibly is none of you, but you will remember the 1980s from television and movies and the popular culture that you see around you. Now, here's a chap here, this one, very fancy. Let's stop the sharing, go back to the meat. Now, who is he? Yes, absolutely right. Well done. Ronald Reagan. Yes. Oh, yes, and you're right. I believe China does own like 900 billion or so of the bonds. Yes. Well done. That was very quick. Anybody know who Ronald Reagan was? He's dead now. What was he? Yes, indeed. He was president of the United States in the 1980s, which is quite significant. Yeah, well done. Sorry, Abu?
Sorry, Lishan just said it. Sorry.
Ah, yes. He was an actor. Yes, before he was president, he was an actor. And there were a lot of jokes going around in the 1980s that the Americans had hired an actor to play the president, which now that we look back on it and we see who else the Americans have hired to play president, you kind of look back with fondness, right? Okay, but he is very significant in economics, okay? In fact, he's so significant that there are books that talk about what's called Reaganomics, essentially talking about his particular philosophy on how economics should work and how the policies he implemented in the 1980s with regards to that. And it's all about supply. So these are policies that are called supply side policies. They tend to be longer term strategies. They tend to be aimed at increasing the productive capacity of the country. So that PPC curve, we're wanting that to shift out, right? We're wanting the economy to grow with the PPC curve. We're wanting to see the quality and or quantity of the factors of production improving, right? That's what we're wanting. So quality, right? Productivity, right? Quantity, the actual number. So we're wanting, let's just take one factor of production. Let's just take labor. We're wanting there to be more labor, and we're wanting the labor to be much better at their jobs. Capital goods, machines, robots, we're wanting more of them, and we're wanting them to be better at what they do. That's a supply side policy. So some examples of supply-side policies that we could consider. This first one, privatization. The idea here being that you had a government-run business and you are now allowing the private sector to run that particular business. So it was previously run by the government, now it's being run by the private sector. So I'm going to stop the sharing, come back to the meat. Can you come up with any real-life examples of a private sector business that used to be run by the government? No, 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 leave. Leave.
What, Dad?
Put it back.
Who's it for?
Put it back.
Who's it for?
Not you.
Not me, the one who sounds like Lego. What is it?
Can I have an example of, a real-life example of privatization? Yeah, I had one from the other class. Yes, telecommunications, that happens quite a bit. Well done. Right. A lot of telecommunications companies tend to have been previously owned by the government, and then they get privatized. I don't know here in Malaysia, I honestly couldn't tell you. But what about some of the other institutions that you see? What about the electricity here in Malaysia? Is that a private company or is it the government run? What about the water distribution? Is that government run or is it private? I'm not sure. It seems to have a private company name. The other class seemed to suggest that the electricity was a private company, and that the government may have sold it off here in Malaysia. But that does sort of happen quite a bit. Water is definitely government owned. Okay, all right. But then maybe in the future they might privatize that. It's a supply side policy. Yeah. In the US, all right, in New Zealand, the railways, okay, they got sold off. Electricity recently been sold. Okay, here you go. Yeah, the technology-based ones tend to, right, because infrastructure-wise, things like the internet bandwidth, that tend to be owned by the government. So the government needs to decide how to sell those off. Right? So yeah, banks, okay, government-owned banks. Right? Again, in New Zealand, we had government-owned banks, sold them off. In the UK, the post office is a big one that they keep arguing about. I don't know if Mr. Piers knows if they have actually sold it off yet, but it is definitely one that has come up again and again and again as to whether they should sell it off, right? Privatize it. The National Health Service in the UK, there are debates about whether that should be privatized. The post office in America is currently government run. Right? It was one of the issues that, with regards to the previous US administration, they were wanting it to be privatized and sold off. Hasn't been, but there were previous people who were wanting that to happen, and they were making moves in order to make sure that it happened. Hasn't happened yet. Now, let's go back. Sorry, oops, someone made a comment. If a government sells off an asset, can it still buy it back? Yes, absolutely it can. So I'm going to stop that because it's scary. Yes, it can. And in New Zealand, the government sold off the railways to a private company, privatized the railways. The company that ran the railways, yeah, let's say some of their ethics weren't the best, and they decided to do a process called asset stripping. And what they ended up doing was basically inflating the share price of the company, and then they sold their shares and left the company. They left the railway. And they didn't invest at all in the railway for a few years. So the railway ended up needing about $1 billion New Zealand dollars worth of investment. And there just wasn't there. So nobody wanted to buy it. So the New Zealand government ended up having to buy it back and ended up having to spend about $1 billion on it. The national airline in New Zealand is currently owned by the New Zealand government. Right? And again, it spent another $1 billion trying to fix the airline and make it worthwhile viable as a business. But they did that, and there were arguments back a number of years now, decades. There were arguments quite some time ago about whether that was an effective use of money, whether they should just sell it off. Right? In fact, the New Zealand government got told off, basically, more or less, by an international body because they spent nearly $2 billion within a short period of time, $1 billion on the railway and $1 billion on the airline. And the international economics body told them that they did the wrong thing. That they should have privatized. They should have just gotten rid of the things. Right? But those are very political, right? Particularly if it's a national airline. All right. Now, privatization, lots of real-life examples. Again, case studies like the UK, post office, etc., are there and available. Deregulation. We talked about how the government put lots of rules and regulations in place. Well, maybe they could get rid of them. And supply-side policy is exactly that. Just get rid of the rules and regulations. So it might be that there are minimum wages, right? Minimum wage laws. We'll get rid of them. It might be that there are environmental legislation. Get rid of it. Because anything that puts costs onto business, you would make an argument that therefore, if you were to remove it, it would decrease the cost for the business. They'd be more able to produce goods and services, etc. However, what we saw, particularly with America, when the previous administration got rid of a whole lot of rules and regulations, it didn't actually allow those businesses to produce more. It just meant that their share prices of those businesses went up. So those who owned the shares ended up getting more money. Right? Capital investment, the idea of infrastructure spending, that's a real big one. And as said, in America, there's huge amounts of capital investment potentially coming. All right, what are we able to do? These are the key skills. You need to be able to define the different policies. You need to be able to analyze them, and you need to be able to critically evaluate them to say, do these policies actually work? So even the supply side idea, right? Check this one out. Let's talk about human capital. That's us, the labor, all right? Let's talk about investing in education. How effective is investing in education? So let's stop the sharing, jump back to the meat. Are there any problems? If the government was to say, spend $100 million, let's build some more schools. Sounds really good, doesn't it? Shouldn't that mean...
It does.
So are there any problems with them doing that? What do you think? Government decides to spend $100 million on more schools. What might the possible problems be with that? Opportunity cost? No. Could use it on other things. Yes. Good. Well done. What else? That's absolutely right. Are there any other problems? What about the actual implication, right, with regards to this? You build a new school, and the assumption is that there's going to be a whole lot of more education. Yeah. Have you heard the expression, you can lead a horse to water?
I think it's a seahorse.
You lead a horse to water, you can't necessarily make it drink. Right? You can build an amazing school, but is that going to guarantee that the students who go to that school are going to get educated? Right? Does it guarantee that they're going to get the learning that they need? Doesn't guarantee it. Right? Just for you, you understand this, I understand this, that not everybody is going to be able to achieve at the top level. Right? There are skills that some people have naturally That means that they're amazing at different things. And maybe some of those skills we aren't able to do. Yeah, some of the technology skills that I see is just blowing my mind. I just don't know that I'm ever going to be able to understand them. Yeah, I struggled enough trying to work out that Discord server for the Student Leadership Forum, how that all worked. Right? Talk about AR and VR, all of those sorts of things. My word. Yeah, but you guys are all digital natives, so all of that sort of stuff, piece of cake. Yeah. So even you understand that there are going to be skills that even if you've got a school dedicated to, let's get everybody up to a certain level. Whoa! But are they all going to get there? Maybe not. Or maybe it'll take longer than you think. I mean, you consider you're in year 10 now, basically year 11, all right? You're in 10 now, so you've been at school for how many years? And then you've got IB, and then you've got university, and you may do postgrad, all right, before you get into the workforce. So government invests the money now. Yes, it's long term, but that's really long term. All right, let's say you do a PhD. PhDs at university take between 4 and 5 years, right? Depending on who you are. You might end up doing double PhD. How about that? That might take you 6 to 8 years. Yeah. That's on top of your graduate degree, which is, between 3 to 4 years. Maybe a master's, another couple of years. All right, and that's on top of the 2 years that you'll do for your IB. All right, and then another year, obviously, for year 11. So, and then you're in the workforce. So, yes, the government can invest, but it's not going to guarantee that you are going to get the education, and it's also a very long-term strategy. And by the time you get out of school, what skills are you going to need? All right, here we are talking about supply-side economics, but that's from the 1980s. And most economists say that supply-side economics actually, parts of it don't work at all. They definitely don't work the way you think they do. Right? The deregulation, as we said, they did it in America. It didn't work the way they wanted it to. All right? But maybe the investing in schools, maybe that will. But as said, opportunity costs, well done. They invest in the schools, they're not able to invest in other things. All right, jumping back into the Nearpod, very last thing, tax reforms. Let's decrease taxes. Let's change the way we tax people. Enterprise zones. For those of you who know about China, who have lived in China before, China has created a lot of enterprise zones. The idea that they are supposed to be business friendly. Right? So we used to live in one. It was the Suzhou Industrial Zone, with the idea being that that's where business was. There were deregulations there. There were tax-free exemptions there. There were rules that applied in other parts of China that didn't apply there with regards to business. So encouraging more business, right? That's what they were all about. New Zealand has what's called incubators. Business incubators, which is kind of like the baby bird sort of scenario, which is protecting little businesses, giving them funding, giving them information, supporting them, paying for them to go overseas to get development on all of those sorts of things. They're incubators. Right? So there are lots of real life examples of all of those too. All right, team, now we're going to finish there for the day. Please review the material. I will share the recording of the lesson when that's all processed through. Please add depth to your notes, particularly about the evaluation aspects, right? Because that's that 6 to 8 marks where you need to put depth into your answers. That's the whether or not, right? Whether or not expansionary fiscal policy will cause Guatemala to see an increase in employment. Yeah, that sort of an idea. All right, team. Otherwise, this would say in the land of my birth, hey, cornet up, which means goodbye for now.